how it works as a pump. We had also talked about blood and how blood is a really, really important component in the cardiovascular system and its role in carrying oxygen and carbon dioxide, and how we use hemoglobin and the differences in plasma and hematocrit. So the last piece of the system that we need to understand so that we can properly understand the changes that go on during and following exercise and during and following development of cardiovascular disease is the vascular system. Okay, so we could spend a huge amount of time on this. I'm very fond of the vascular system. As part of my master's degree, the lab that I worked in, we did some work on the function of peripheral arteries and how they became impaired with aging and different kinds of cardiovascular disease and with smoking. So I always kind of think very fondly of this, but I'll try to just hit some of the high points with all of this for you guys. Okay, so we're going to primarily focus on kind of the 5 big types of blood vessels. We're going to focus on large arteries, which are things like the aorta or the brachial artery. Okay, these relatively large vessels that are going to take blood from the heart and get it out in the general vicinity of a particular muscle or another particular organ. Okay, we're going to probably spend the most amount of time though talking about as the arteries get smaller and smaller as they get closer towards different tissues, they shrink down and branch off into these vessels called arterioles. Okay, and so arterioles have some special structures on them, and arterioles are going to be the ones that are going to help us control where blood flow is going at any one given point in time. We always have 4 or 5 or 6 liters of blood in our body, but the vascular system has the ability to change and manipulate. Is that blood going to my muscles? Is that blood going to my brain? Is it going to my digestive system? You know, it has the ability to change those kinds of things around, mostly based upon the arterioles and things that can happen in the arterioles that we will talk about in a little bit of depth in the next coming slides. After arterioles, there are capillaries. Capillaries are very small. They're a single cell layer thick, and they have lots of holes in them that can allow for the passage of molecules in and out of them. Capillaries are where diffusion is going to take place between the vascular system and any tissue that it is in essence connected to. So for our purposes, that would be muscle or skeletal muscle or cardiac muscle, but it can also be in the digestive system. It can be in the brain. There's a whole host of things that are going to be there. Capillaries then are going to move themselves back up into venules, these smaller venules, and then the venules are going to all come back together and produce the large veins that we can see. The bros have lots of in their forearms and various places that are going to help us return blood back to the heart. All right. Okay. So, what to know about arterioles, right? So, arterioles are often termed resistance vessels. And I'm not going to ask the question because if you've taken it, you'll just want to like flip me off or something. But if you've had physics 2 and you've either dealt with the movement of fluids or you've dealt with the movement of electricity, then resistance is gonna mean a little something different to you guys. And so when we talk about arterioles, the reason they're called resistance vessels is that the arterioles are going to have the ability to control how easy or difficult, so the resistance, okay, how easy or difficult it is to get blood flow into a particular tissue, okay? And so the reason that arterioles are the ones that do this is, one, it lets us have a little more control than just simply saying, I got this big artery, can I make the blood go through this big artery? Well, that big artery is going to bring blood to my bicep, my tricep, right, the tissues in my elbow, right? All of my kind of forearm muscles, all of my finger flexors and extensors, okay? So the arterioles are a little bit smaller, they're a little closer to a particular tissue, and so it gives us a little bit more kind of fine tuning of where it's going. But the way arterioles work and the way that we control where blood flow goes is by having an arteriole change its diameter. So you have an arteriole. If that arteriole contracts and squeezes down on itself, okay, it's going to make it more difficult for blood to go through there. And so the tissues downstream of that arteriole will get less blood, okay? Conversely, if I have an arteriole and it widens itself out and it dilates and it gets bigger, then it's going to be easier for blood to flow through there. And so the tissues downstream of that arteriole will receive more blood flow, okay? So the way that arterioles can manipulate their diameter, the way they can change their size, is through the contracting or relaxing of something called vascular smooth muscle, okay? Vascular smooth muscle. And so what you guys see here in the picture, this is vascular smooth muscle. Here's the inside of my arteriole here. This is the smooth muscle that's surrounding the outside of it, okay? So you have a blood vessel, and then all around the outside of that arteriole is going to be this smooth muscle, just like the smooth muscle in many ways that lines or is around your digestive system. And so as that smooth muscle contracts, then the arteriole, the diameter gets smushed down, its diameter gets smaller, the blood pressure inside of it goes up. If the pressure inside of it goes up, then the difference in pressure from whatever is proximal to it is going to be smaller, so less blood flow will go through. If that smooth muscle relaxes, then it's going to dilate out and get bigger, okay? The pressure inside drops, so you get a larger pressure gradient from whatever the proximal artery is, and so that makes it easier for blood flow to go through there, okay? So you have arterioles that lead to every tissue in your body, okay? Every tissue. And so those arterioles are going to respond, that vascular smooth muscle will respond to a host of different signals, some coming from the sympathetic nervous system, some coming from local metabolic processes and things going on within that particular tissue, and it will alter whether you're going to get more or less blood going to that tissue, okay? Our ability to do this allows us to exercise. Our ability to do this allows us to digest food, okay? Our ability to do this allows us to maintain blood flow to the brain while other things are going on. Our ability to do this allows us to send blood flow to the skin to allow the dissipation of heat through sweating. So if the vascular smooth muscle does not work properly, if your arterioles cannot properly control their diameters and manipulate where blood flow goes, then we're going to be in trouble very, very quickly. So it's really, really important that all of this functions correctly, okay? What you guys see in front of you is this is kind of a blow up of an electrocardiogram. And what this is they've infused dye into the cardiovascular system, into the blood, and they're taking a picture of the blood vessels. Basically, it's an X-ray that's being taken with this dye that looks a certain way. And so what you can see here is this is what we would call a vascular tree. Somewhere on the left side of the screen here would be kind of a large artery. Then we have these larger ones here are going to be what we call primary arterioles, and then they branch perpendicularly. So they branch into a secondary arteriole, right? And then the secondary arteriole branches off perpendicular into a tertiary arteriole, and then blah, 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 blah. They get smaller and smaller and smaller until they become capillaries, okay? And so the things that you guys see out here running parallel or kind of out here is those are skeletal muscle fibers. And so this is a picture of the vascular tree bringing things down. Here are going to be the capillaries supplying blood to this muscle. Okay. You don't have to know primary arterioles. You don't have to know secondary and tertiary. The very, very last ones before the capillaries are called terminal arterioles. You don't have to know that. I just want you to get a picture so that you can think about what the vascular tree looks like, and think about that I've got lots of different places to be able to dilate or constrict to control where blood flow is going to go. Okay. So what we have done in these next pictures is, these are the same kinds of pictures, but we've just focused in on a single arteriole. And so what you see in the top one here, you will see these little rings going around the vessel. It looks like a little Michelin tire man or something. Those rings are smooth muscle. And so that's the muscle that can contract or relax and alter the diameter of those arterioles. So I mentioned that that vascular smooth muscle can receive some input from several places that will tell it to either contract or relax and alter its diameter. One of the ways that it does that is that smooth muscle in the arterioles has connections to or is innervated by the sympathetic nervous system. And so in the second picture that you see here, this is, they have infused dye into the nerves, and then they've dissolved away the smooth muscle, and they've dissolved away the blood vessel, and all you're left with is the dye that is contained in those nerve fibers. And so what you can see then is that every piece of smooth muscle has a connection to the sympathetic nervous system. So it's going to have an ability to respond to epinephrine and norepinephrine that's going to be released by these sympathetic nerves. Okay. So when you get into a situation where you are stressed or you are embarrassed and sympathetic nervous system input goes up, then that's going to have one effect on the vascular smooth muscle. Simultaneously, when you exercise, sympathetic nervous system input or outflow also goes up. That's going to have an effect that's going to go on these resistance vessels. Okay. Okay. All right. So that's the general kind of gist of how we manipulate those things. So let's talk now about capillaries, and let's talk about veins. Okay. So we mentioned the capillaries are these very, very narrow single cell wall blood vessels. You can look in the picture down here. You can see the striping of our skeletal muscle fibers. Here is a single capillary that's going to go there. You can see the capillaries in a lot of places end up being only wide enough to fit one erythrocyte or one red blood cell through at a time. Okay. So you can see in our capillary a red blood cell. You can see in there a white blood cell. These are going to be the thin capillary walls that are only one cell layer thick. And so the red blood cells are going to be very close here to our muscle. Because of all of that, then we're going to get the diffusion of oxygen and CO2 across the capillary, O2 in, CO2 out. You can see a white blood cell there. You can also imagine that in the blood there might be hormones, testosterone or estrogen or cortisol or insulin or something that can also then cross those membranes. There might be glucose, or there might be lipids from something that you've eaten in there, and that's also going to get across there. Okay. A key thing to understand about veins that's pretty important as well, that I'm sure you guys learned in anatomy class, is veins help bring blood back to the heart. And one of the ways that they do that is that veins have valves in them. And by having a valve in a vein, it prevents the backwards flow of blood through them. And so you're going to shove the blood through the arteries into the capillaries, and then as it begins its trek back towards the heart, imagine a scenario where you have veins that are down in your calves and your heart is up here. So that blood has to move against gravity. Okay. So there may be some situations where gravity is trying to pull the blood down, but you have these valves in the veins, and the valves clamp shut, so the blood can't get past that valve and go backwards. It can only move forward. Okay. Again, when you get into exercise physiology class, Dr. Mike will talk at much, much greater length about all of the mechanisms and the control of blood flow, the control of getting blood back to the heart. It's something called venous return. There's some things that happen during exercise that help improve venous return, but it's somewhat beyond the scope of this particular class. Okay. So if we understand how we move the blood around, I think it's also important for us to know where is the blood normally. Okay, so where are the arterioles sending blood under normal circumstances, and then how might that change during a bout of exercise? Okay, a general rule of thumb for blood distribution is that the body is going to send blood to tissues that are metabolically active. Okay, so normally, your most metabolically active tissues, if you're just resting, are going to be the liver, okay, where the blood is going to be filtered and processed and things, as well as the kidneys, okay. Blood goes through the kidneys, again, more filtering going on there. We're going to take some stuff out. We're going to produce urine, okay. So when you're at rest, about 50% of the blood flow in your body is going to the liver and the kidneys. If you've just eaten a meal or eaten a meal within maybe the last 30 minutes or so, there's going to be additional blood flow that's going to also be going to the digestive system. Okay? It's going to the stomach. It's also going very much so to the small intestine for absorption. At rest, skeletal muscle gets about 15% of all of the blood flow in your body. Okay, your brain's getting a certain amount, your heart's getting a certain amount. Those things are going to have to remain constant so those tissues can always function. But in our other ones, we have an ability to kind of shift the blood around from one place to the other based upon where we need it. So during a bout of exercise, we're going to shift the metabolic demand within the body. As we begin to exercise, as we begin to do any kind of physical activity, the energy being produced in the muscles is going to go way up. We need that energy to allow for actin and myosin to interact, to allow for contractions, to allow for movement. So as you start to exercise, we're going to begin to send maybe 80% to 85% of the blood in your body is going to go to the skeletal muscle. And so what happens is the brain keeps a constant amount of blood flow. Okay, blood flow to the heart is actually going to go up a little bit during exercise. The brain is constant, heart goes up. Almost everything else then is going to skeletal muscle. We're not going to send blood to the kidneys. We're not going to send blood to the liver. We're not going to send blood to the digestive system. This is why they tell you not to go swimming for an hour after you've eaten. Okay, is that you begin to digest food. And if you start swimming, you do physical activity, you're going to shunt all of the blood in your body away from your stomach, away from the intestines, and you're going to have somewhat undigested or partially digested food stuck in there with no blood to help aid in the absorption and kind of moving digestion along. And that's why you may feel sick to your stomach. Okay. So we're going to send a larger percentage of our blood to the muscles. If we combine that with the fact that heart rate and stroke volume go up during exercise, so cardiac output goes up during exercise, the body has the capacity to increase the amount of blood going to skeletal muscle by about 25 times that of what it is at rest during exercise. If you account for the fact that we send more blood to the muscles and that the blood that we do have is circulating through more and more frequently. Okay, so we have to have this massive capacity to send blood that's going to have the oxygen and the nutrients that we need to make energy to our muscles during exercise, or we're not going to be able to exercise for very long. Okay, so people that have impairments in the cardiovascular system, or they have impairments in their ability to control where they're sending blood, are going to have a reduced exercise capacity. And that's a big problem with cardiovascular disease. And it's also a big problem in people that are relatively sedentary. Okay. All right. Does anybody have questions about that? I know I've kind of thrown a lot at you guys relatively quickly there. No? Everybody's good? Going once? Going twice? Bueller? Anybody seen the movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off?
Yes, I love that movie. It's a classic.
It is a classic, or at least like the first hour is a classic in that way. Okay. Some of the computer stuff that he's doing in like 1985 seems pretty simple by today's standards. But the next slide is just a visual representation of what is happening, right? Heavy exercise, resting, okay? And it shows the tissues and it shows the percentage. It shows you what the cardiac output is, and it shows you the percentage of that cardiac output that's going to a given tissue. So we have rest and we have heavy exercise. And the big things to make note of are that skeletal muscles, blood flow goes way up. Skin blood flow, especially if it's hot outside, is going to go up just a little bit. And blood flow to the kidneys and the liver and the digestive system are going to go down markedly, while the brain amount stays about the same, but its percentage of overall cardiac output is going to go down because cardiac output goes up so much. Okay. So I always debate whether I should bother explaining what our AVO2 difference is to you guys. Let me explain this concept, but I don't want you guys to worry about like what the numbers that are associated with it are going to be. Okay, so the importance of this measure. So what we're looking at here is something called arterial-venous oxygen difference, or it's typically called AVO2 difference. This is just a way that in the laboratory that we can measure the amount of oxygen that has been taken from arterial blood into our tissues. Okay, so it's a way of looking at oxygen delivery or oxygen uptake into a particular tissue. And we calculate AVO2 difference by making some estimate of how much oxygen is in arterial blood, which we can assume is going to be held pretty constant once it gets to the capillaries, and then measuring how much oxygen is in venous blood that's leaving a particular tissue. Okay, so imagine a scenario like this. Okay, for the purposes of you guys not having to look at my poor man thighs, we're going to use my arm here. Okay, so imagine a situation where you've gone to the doctor and you've gone to a cardiologist, and what they're going to do is to make this measurement, they're going to run a catheter into both your brachial artery and your brachial vein. Okay, and then by doing that, we can take a sample of blood that's in the brachial artery and a sample of blood from the brachial vein. And while we're going to do that, we're going to have you start exercising. So I'm going to start doing curls, okay? Or maybe I'm going to ride a bike with my arms like this, okay? And what we're going to measure then is how does the oxygen content in my brachial artery change, and how does the oxygen content in the brachial vein change? And the short answer is that as long as your lungs function correctly, the amount of oxygen in arterial blood is going to be relatively constant all the time, okay? As the tissue becomes more metabolically active, it's going to pull more oxygen out of the arterial blood. So the amount of oxygen in venous blood is going to decline. And as exercise intensity goes up and up, as I lift a heavier and heavier weight, or as I run faster and faster and faster, metabolic rate in those muscles is going to go up, energy use is going to go up, so I'm going to have to pull more and more and more oxygen out of arterial blood. So in that way, during exercise, the AVO2 difference is going to get bigger. And that's one way for us to measure something that we call oxygen extraction. This is going to become an important thing for an equation that we're going to see in lecture 7. Okay, so I just want to leave this here right now. I just want you to know in a very general sense that this is what it is. Okay, hopefully when we see the something called the Fick equation, we can use this. We can use the AVO2 difference in conjunction with cardiac output as a way to estimate what your metabolic rate is. But we're going to get into that. It'll probably be tomorrow before we do all of that. Okay. We're going to take a very quick whirlwind tour through the pulmonary or respiratory system. A lot of books refer to it as the respiratory system. It's probably better called the pulmonary system. Although of all of the physiology that I am comfortable teaching, this is probably the stuff that I know the least about, is pulmonary and respiratory physiology. But the main structures that we're going to concern ourselves with for this class are very large, very simple structures that you guys have probably seen multiple times. Okay, the lungs, the alveoli or the alveolar air sacs that are going to be contained within the lungs, and then some specialized capillaries that are going to surround those alveoli called pulmonary capillaries. Okay. All that we're really going to cover with this, everyone, is we're just going to cover how do we get air in and out, and then how do we diffuse oxygen and CO2 across everything there. Wait, I'm trying to pull up chat. I think we had a question in chat. Will the AVO2 difference concept be on our exam, or will it be on the exam that lecture 7 is a part of? So, great question, Kiana. If there is a question about AVO2 difference on this particular exam, it will just be a very simple, like a definition type question, like what is it? Okay. There will not be any applications of using it in conjunction with something else. That will be on the next exam when we learn, hopefully tomorrow, kind of how we use that parameter in conjunction with some other ones. Okay, so good question. Okay, so most of you guys know where the lungs are. We're not going to get into the individualized anatomy and the lobes of the lungs, or the branching of the bronchiolar tree or anything like that. Okay, I just want you to know, lungs, big picture, lungs are going to be the things that let us bring air in and out. We call that process of bringing air in and inhaling and exhaling, we call that ventilation. Okay, you're ventilating in the lungs. Okay, I don't know what's happening now. Why am I not going forward? The process of ventilation is going to have two parts to it. Okay, and those parts are controlled by your diaphragm. I have a hard time telling, like, how far down can y'all see? Maybe I don't want to know, but diaphragm here. Okay, and so when you take a breath in, okay, what's going to happen when I inspire is that my diaphragm is going to fall down and it's going to expand my chest cavity. As my chest cavity expands, the pressure inside of it declines. As that pressure declines, the pressure in my lungs is going to be lower than air pressure. Air is going to want to move in as long as my mouth or my nose is open. Okay? When I expire, I relax the diaphragm and it pushes itself back up, shrinks the chest cavity down. As it shrinks, then it's going to increase the pressure inside the chest cavity. Pressure inside now becomes greater than pressure outside, so that's going to force air back out. Okay? That's the idea of inspiration and expiration. At rest, expiration is entirely passive. It's just the simple relaxation of the diaphragm. Most of the time at rest, almost all inspiration is due to diaphragm. We're not using our intercostal muscles very much at all. As you begin to exercise, or as you breathe more deeply, or you expire more forcefully, then we can begin to not only we can contract some additional muscles during inspiration, and we can contract some additional muscles during expiration to kind of help force air out. Okay. All right. So one of the things I'm trying to think of how to discuss this in a way that's not going to be too far afield, but also make a little bit more sense. So one of the things that's really important, and this is one of the reasons why sometimes it becomes easier or more difficult to breathe, is all of the movement of air into and out of the lungs is controlled by differences in air pressure from inside my lungs to outside, so in the atmosphere that is surrounding me. So anything that changes my ability to alter either increasing or decreasing the pressure inside my lungs, or if we were to alter the air pressure outside of us, can have some effect on our ability to move air around. Okay. So I had this experience this morning when Ellis and I were playing. She was essentially sitting on my diaphragm. Okay. She likes to take my phone from me and sit on my diaphragm and like do weird things with my phone, and like throw and try to hit me in the face with it. I should probably put a stop to that, but she's just so darn cute. And so when she sits on my diaphragm, I cannot contract my diaphragm nearly as well. So I can, and plus she's there, so I can't open my chest cavity as much. So the pressure inside my lungs cannot fall as much, so it's more difficult to bring air in. Okay. There are certain kinds of lung and pulmonary disorders that are going to cause something very similar to happen. Obesity can also have the same effect. It's what's called a restrictive lung disease, where being obese does not allow the chest cavity to expand as much during inspiration as we would like. Therefore, you can't drop air pressure inside, and it's more difficult to bring air in. Okay, so that's going to be kind of some of the mechanics of all of that. All right, so here's what I want everybody to do. We're gonna play a small little game right now. So anybody that is willing, okay, anybody that's willing, turn your camera on for me if you're willing to do this. We're all gonna do this together, okay? But if you're able and willing, fire on your camera. All right. It's lovely to see so many of you guys' faces here this morning. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I've got my phone out. We are, and what I want you to do is I want you to watch somebody else on the screen that's next to you. We're going to hold our breath. Okay. As we hold our breath, we're doing this so we can watch, so that we can tell if people are cheating, basically. But I want you guys, we're gonna hold our breath, and we're gonna try to hold our breath for 30 seconds. Okay, we're gonna try to hold for 30 seconds. And what we're gonna do by holding our breath for 30 seconds is I'm going to manipulate the oxygen and CO2 environment in your lungs, and in your arterial blood and in your venous blood. And we're going to see what that does to how often we feel like we want to breathe. Okay? Everybody ready? I'm going to cheat. Okay? And go. Ah, what? No, shit. What happened? All right, go. Stop. Okay. I think some of y'all were cheating and breathing through your noses, but I'm not going to name names at this point. All right. What did you feel like when you were done? Somebody tell me, did you feel like you had to take a pretty deep breath right when you finished? You wanted to go really quickly, or was that just me because I'm an old man?
I felt that way too.
You felt that way too, Judy? Okay. So, all right. Thank you all for humoring me. You may all go back to not showing us your video if you would like. So what I did is I manipulated the oxygen and CO2 environment by having you hold your breath. And so the reason that I did this was to try to illustrate that your breathing, okay, much like your heart rate, while you do have some level of conscious control over breathing, if I ask you to breathe faster, right, or breathe slower, you have some level of conscious control over contracting your diaphragm or not. But the other side of that is that you don't ever have to think about it if you don't want to, like especially at rest, right? So like Judy is sitting there and she's watching, and most of the time if you're taking notes, you're typing, you're doing something, you don't have to think about, oh yeah, I need to breathe right now. It's much like your heart rate. So there are centers in your brain, okay, um, I believe they're in the hypothalamus. I don't know why that's escaping me at this exact moment, but you have something called the respiratory centers, and they're in your brain, and they control the rate and depth of your breathing. And much like the SA node in the respiratory centers, there's going to be this kind of relatively constant at rest outflow that says, okay, contract the diaphragm, relax. Contract the diaphragm, relax. Okay. Most of you guys at rest are going to take somewhere between maybe 6 and 12 or 15 breaths per minute. It just depends. Okay. But in the thalamus, there's going to be innervation that then goes to the motor cortex and controls all of that. But we have an ability. So the thalamus is going to be checking, the hypothalamus is going to be checking as things go through there, the chemical environment in your blood. And it's going to use that to decide if you need to breathe more often or less often, if you need to breathe more deeply or more shallow. Okay? And the two primary things that the brain is monitoring in order to adjust your breathing may seem a little strange to you guys. I know they've always also seemed strange to me. What we care about is oxygen use. We care about having enough oxygen. If you're not getting enough oxygen, then you need to breathe more often. But the brain doesn't really check on or monitor oxygen. What it does is it monitors carbon dioxide levels, and it monitors levels of hydrogen ions. Okay? As CO2 in your arterial blood, especially as CO2 levels go up because metabolic rate has increased, or like what we were doing when we were holding our breath, you were not able to blow off CO2 because you weren't breathing, then blood levels of CO2 are going to rise. Then that's going to stimulate the respiratory centers to make you breathe more often or more frequently and more deeply, which is why we all mostly want to take that kind of big deep breath right when we stop holding our breath. And if I'd ask you to count the number of breaths you were taking in the minute or so after you let go holding your breath, you probably would have taken more breaths during that minute than you had in the minute prior to holding your breath. Okay.
Question.
So, yes, Whitney.
So people can like train to hold their breath longer. So how does that work?
So some of it is you are training the ability of yourself to have conscious inhibitory control over the respiratory center, making your diaphragm contract, basically, right? So when you hold your breath, what you are doing is you are exerting conscious control to not breathe, right? They always tell you, like little kids, Ellis hasn't done this yet, but at some point they're going to get mad, like, I'm going to hold my breath. That's fine. Hold your breath as long as you want. You will eventually have to breathe. You can't suffocate yourself by holding your breath. Eventually the urge becomes so strong that you will take a breath. But what you're doing when you train things is you're learning a couple of things, I assume. One, you're learning how to calm your other body processes so that you're making less CO2, needless CO2 from metabolism. You're lowering your metabolic rate, and you're training your brain, in essence, to be able to withstand and overcome that really, really strong urge to breathe. Okay. They do some other things too. You can do some breathing exercises And so you can train lung capacity and stuff so that when you take that one big breath, right before you hold your breath, you're able to blow off as much CO2 as possible and bring in as much oxygen as possible, okay? Because what's happening when I hold my breath is my metabolic rate hasn't really changed. All that I am changing is my tissues are still making carbon dioxide as a byproduct of aerobic metabolism. They're still using oxygen, making CO2. I'm just not breathing off that CO2. So the level of CO2 in my blood is going to rise, and that stimulates the respiratory centers, and they're communicating, this isn't great. We're building up CO2 and using oxygen. We're not bringing in more oxygen. We need to fix this. You need to breathe. And that's kind of what happens there.
Cool. Thank you. That makes sense.
They also cheat, if you want to call it cheating, beforehand, and they'll breathe really deeply for several breaths beforehand. And what they are doing is they're forcibly hyperventilating. And as they hyperventilate, they're blowing off as much carbon dioxide as they possibly can. So they're lowering their blood CO2 levels as much as possible before they hold their breath. So if you imagine that there is some level of blood CO2 at which I'm going to have to breathe, no matter what, okay? And I want to lower that initial CO2 level as much as I can so I've got more room or more time to get up to that level, or I'm going to have to breathe. That's what they're doing. Okay, great question. Great question. I think a lot of those people that do all of that are mildly crazy. I can appreciate what it is that they're doing. The people that do it, like they dive like way down, you know, and see how far down they can dive and stuff. I'm basically just a complete coward, and I'm terrified that, like, you know, I'll drown myself or something if I do all of that. But you have these what are called chemoreceptors that are going to sense CO2 and hydrogen. They're located in the aorta and in your carotid arteries, and they're going to help control different things. If any of you guys have ever like stood up too fast and you've felt lightheaded or something, or you've stood up too fast and you've passed out, we can use the combination of the CO2 receptors and something called baroreceptors, which are gonna kind of sense changes in blood pressure. We can do some things, and we can make your brain think that its oxygen levels are going to fall, and it will make you pass out so that you'll fall down, and that way you can stop holding your breath or stop being at a weird posture. We used to do it when I was in high school at baseball practice when we would get bored in the outfield. But if you lean over and you put your head down between your legs and you take like 15 really, really deep, kind of consecutive deep breaths, and then stand up really fast, and then just go, just squeeze on your carotid arteries ever so slightly, down you go. You can make yourself kind of faint. I think back on that and think maybe we were dumb teenagers at the time, but that's kind of where we are. But that's how we control breathing, okay? So when you begin exercising, your changes in the rate of inspiration and expiration and the depth of inspiration and expiration are going to go up. So ventilation is going to increase in proportion with exercise. And that's because as you expend more energy in your muscles, you are making more CO2, which then drives the respiratory centers to alter breathing rate and breathing depth. If you're exercising really, really hard, you're not only making more CO2, but you're making lactic acid. That lactic acid is going to dissociate and produce hydrogen ions, which is going to further stimulate breathing. Okay. So what I'm hopeful of is that maybe you guys are beginning to see how exercise is an integrated physiological process where things that happen in the muscles drive changes that are going to happen in the cardiovascular system, in the metabolic system, in the pulmonary system, and all of them have to fit together properly to allow us to do things. Okay. So as we mentioned, that ventilation is the process of bringing air in and out. It is the breathing analog to cardiac output. Okay, so it's the amount of air that flows through the lungs each minute. We can calculate respiration if we were inclined to do so by multiplying something called respiratory rate, or RR, which is just the number of breaths that you take. So BPM is breaths per minute. And then the volume of something called tidal volume, which is the amount of air that moves in and out every time you breathe. You multiply the number of breaths by how much air moves in each breath, and you get ventilation. Again, like cardiac output, we measure this in liters per minute, so it's liters of air that are moved per minute. I could give you guys numbers of what normal ventilation is in a regular sized person at rest versus an athlete, what it can be after breath holding, what it can be if you have asthma or something, but the numbers are kind of less important than the general concept. If you take exercise testing and prescription, they go into a lot more detail about how we can measure and assess the function of the pulmonary system. Okay, so if any of you have asthma or have ever been tested for asthma, which to me is not a particularly pleasant thing. I had it done when I was in high school. We can look at different portions of things that are going on when you ventilate, and that can tell us stuff about how well is your diaphragm working, how elastic are your lungs, and some other things that can give us some ideas of whether or not the lungs are functioning properly. And that's what the graph on the left here shows, is that we have this kind of normal, relaxed breathing at rest where the certain amount of air moves in and then out and in and then out, right? And you take a big deep breath in, and you have this thing called inspiratory reserve volume. So you can suck in a lot more air than what you normally do at rest. There is some kind of top end of all of that, but you could suck in more, right? That can give us this inspiratory reserve volume, which may become impaired if you have certain pulmonary disorders. We can then ask you to blow out as much air as possible afterwards. We can figure out what your expiratory reserve volume is. And then we can look at kind of the total ability to bring air in and out. And so each of these things tells us something slightly different. It can be slightly different from a diagnostic standpoint as well. And so if you want to know more about this, you will do a lab in exercise testing and prescription called a spirometry lab, but you will breathe into a machine and it will tell you what all of these things are. When people have asthma, there's going to be a decrease in their pulmonary function, and then they can test them. They can then give them an inhaler. You can take a hit from the inhaler and get a bronchial dilator. And then typically you will see some of these parameters change, and they'll look more like a regular, kind of normally functioning person. Okay, but that's kind of the idea behind measuring ventilation. When you exercise, ventilation goes up very, very quickly. Okay, and then it's going to go up quickly, and then it's going to have kind of a gradual increase, and then as long as the metabolic rate doesn't change, if you reach a steady state there, like you're running at the same speed for a while, then it will gradually plateau off. Okay, the immediate increase in breathing, I could ask any of you guys to just stand up where you are, or just like wave your arm over your head, and as soon as you move, there are some stretch receptors and things, proprioceptors in your joints that are also connected to the respiratory center. So anytime you move, breathing goes up immediately, because the brain understands, in a manner of speaking, that there's been movement, there's been more muscle contractions, therefore there may continue to be movement. We may need more oxygen, so make breathing go up immediately. There's a more gradual increase that's going to match breathing to what's happening in the chemoreceptors, so it's going to match it to CO2 production primarily. And then after exercise, when you stop exercising, breathing is going to stay elevated for a little while after a bout of exercise or any kind of exertion. Okay, it remains elevated because metabolic rate remains elevated after a bout of exercise. Both breathing and the cardiovascular function and cardiac output are going to remain increased. And they will eventually decay back down towards a normal baseline level over some reasonably small period of time. It may be as short as, a minute or two, or sometimes it may take, 10 to 20 minutes, depending upon how in shape you are, what it was that you were doing, what the atmospheric oxygen content is. But you've got to maintain got to regulate pH. You have to try to get and remove all the extra CO2 from your blood. You're going to need increased energy as your body tries to clean everything up after a bout of exercise. Okay? One of the ways that we could estimate who is in the best shape from an endurance standpoint is to have two people perform the exact same bout of exercise. So we could have someone run half a mile at some particular pace, and then when they have them stop, and we can measure their breathing when they've stopped, and the person whose ventilation returns to normal the fastest is probably the person that is in the best aerobic shape. So if you're really sedentary and you're very out of shape, it will take your breathing longer to go back to normal, because your other processes take longer to go back to normal than a person that's in better shape. Okay, so it's 11:45. Let's go ahead and we will take our break here. So I'm going to stop sharing, and we're going to resume recording. Okay, so let's keep going and keep talking about what all is happening here. I'm going to skip over the slide on breathing irregularities. These are very common. They're relatively straightforward. You guys can look at all of that. So we're going to finish off the things in this lecture by going into kind of what are the cardiovascular responses to exercise. Okay, and we've mentioned most of these at various points over the last 2 days, but I want to give a more formal walkthrough of exactly what's changing and kind of how it's changing in relation to other things. Okay, so what we do know is that when you start exercising, cardiac output increases. Both stroke volume and heart rate are going to go up as we begin to exercise. We are going to move blood flow from, and I know that it says skin blood flow on here twice, so it should say increased cardiac output. It should say increased muscle blood flow, okay, in the second one. So we're going to take blood from the kidneys and spleen and send it to our muscles, okay? We're going to have more flow through the coronary arteries. We're going to have maybe a little bit more flow through the brain. We're going to have some that's going to go to the skin. These are the primary cardiovascular responses, okay? What I don't have written on here is that also blood pressure tends to increase during a bout of exercise. By having blood pressure increase, then we're going to have a higher, what we typically call driving pressure. So pressure in the heart is going to go up, so pressure in the arteries goes up. So there's a larger difference between arterial pressure and, say, alveolar. God, I cannot talk right now. Not alveolar. Between arterial and arteriolar blood pressure and capillary blood pressure. So what it does is it makes it easier for the blood to move through the vessels. So larger pressure difference, okay? So the change in cardiac output that occurs with exercise happens in what we would graphically describe as a linear manner, okay? So what you see here on the y-axis is the variable of cardiac output. So this is heart rate over a given minute multiplied by the stroke volume every time the heart beats. Here you can see our cardiac output at rest is a little over 5 liters per minute. And then we put a person on a treadmill and we've had them walk and then run at increasingly higher and higher velocities. So this is treadmill speed. The book that I got this from is a European book, so it's expressed in kilometers per hour. And so what you can see, though, is just imagine I'm going from rest to walking to jog to run, and what happens is that cardiac output goes up linearly. As we reach very, very near maximal exercise capacity, one of the things that may happen is that cardiac output will go up and then it will plateau off. We will reach a point where no matter what we do, we cannot make your heart beat any faster, and we cannot make the left ventricle contract any more forcefully. When we reach that place, cardiac output will level off. It will have, in essence, maxed itself out. Once we reach that point with cardiac output, fatigue or needing to slow down or stop exercising is going to happen very, very close or very soon after all of that, okay? You are, if you've reached that place, you are giving almost everything that you can give. And we'll talk a little bit in the next couple of slides about how we might know if we are approaching that, okay? So why is this increase going to happen? Why is it relatively linear? So in order to understand the hows and the whys of the increase in cardiac output, we need to understand the individual changes in response to exercise that occur with heart rate and the individual responses that occur with stroke volume. As I said, both of these things go up during exercise, okay? I'm going to start off by talking about the second one, by talking about stroke volume, and then we'll come back and we'll get heart rate second, okay? So stroke volume goes up for about the first maybe, I don't know, 40 or 50% towards maximal exercise intensity. So what that means is, if I go back a slide, that this increase somewhere in kind of to about right here or so. So in the first half of our trip towards reaching maximal cardiac output, stroke volume is only going to go up in this early portion here, okay? When you do aerobic exercise and it is going to go to an intensity of maybe 50 to 60% of your maximal aerobic exercise ability. So stroke volume goes up through maybe brisk jogging, okay? So when you go from rest to walking, stroke volume goes up. When you go from walking to jogging, stroke volume is going to continue to go up. When you go from jogging slowly to jogging briskly, it's going to go up a little bit more. But then as you go from jogging briskly to kind of running, if you will, then there's not going to be a further increase in stroke volume. Some of that is due to a physical limitation inside the heart, okay? Due to a physical limitation inside the heart. Trying to pull up and look at our question. Okay, Shelby said it's freezing up for her. Is it freezing up for anybody else? Can you guys hear me okay? Okay, it's been okay for Maddie. Kiana's okay. All right. So I'm sorry, Shelby. I'll try to move a little closer to my computer without having you guys look up my nose and see if maybe the audio, that will help a little bit. But it's also possible that maybe it was just a little catch up or a hang up on your end. So there are physical limitations to the left ventricle, okay? So I got rid of and I recycled my my bottles from yesterday, but I do have another Gatorade bottle here today. So if you imagine that this is my left ventricle, okay? All of us have a certain volume inside of our left ventricle that can be filled up with blood, okay? There's not anything that we can do to make this any bigger during a bout of exercise, okay? There's only so much blood that can be held in there. And so one of the things that happens is, remember that at rest, we only eject about 2/3 of the blood in the left ventricle every time that it beats, okay? As we begin to exercise, we're going to raise that ejection fraction, so we're getting closer and closer and closer to ejecting all of the blood that's going to be in there. And so part of that is going to be due to something called increased preload, and that increase in preload is going to have some effects on how forcefully the left ventricle contracts. We're then also going to have some additional impact on the how hard it contracts from the sympathetic nervous system, okay? Does anybody want to volunteer to try something on camera for me? Anybody want to volunteer? I'm going to ask you to jump. That's all you're going to have to do for me, is you're going to have to jump. Nobody wants to turn on their camera and do it? Any takers? Okay. Well, you're testing me here. You're gonna make me want to do it myself, I guess. So let me put this back. Don't want. Preston says he doesn't want to. Madison says how high doesn't matter. Okay. Any jump is fine. You'll do it, Madison. Thank you so much for being a good. So now, everybody, what I want you to do is I want you to watch Madison. Madison, I'm going to give you a countdown. Okay, I'm going to go 3, 2, 1, and then I want you to jump. Okay, and just if you can, just try to jump up and like act like you want to touch the ceiling. Okay, 3, 2, 1, go. Perfect. Thank you so much. Okay. What did Madison do right before she jumped?
I bent my knees.
You bent your knees. That's right. Okay. You bent your knees. Do you know why? Can you imagine what would have happened if you don't bend? Can you imagine trying to jump without bending your knees first? Could you jump as high? What do we think? I'll ask somebody. Tyler, what do you think? Do you think Madison could have jumped as high if she hadn't bent her knees? Uh-oh. Tyler? Tyler, are you there? Oh, no. Okay. We'll try somebody else. Let's do Sean. I know Sean just put something on the chat. So Sean, do you think Madison could have jumped as high if she hadn't bent her knees?
No, I don't think she would have been able to.
She would not have been able to. So I would encourage all of you guys to try this. Maybe when class is over and you're not in a place to startle your downstairs neighbors or something, try jumping without bending your knees. Okay. So the heart functions in the same way. So the idea of what is happening in the muscle, that it makes it advantageous to bend your knees before you jump, also happens in the heart. And it's something called a stretch shortening cycle. And so what that means is that when Madison bends her knees and sinks down before she jumps up, what she is doing is in the primary mover, so in the agonist muscles, like in her quads and in her glutes that she's going to use to propel herself upwards, as she goes down, she's actually doing an eccentric contraction in those muscles. So she's stretching those muscles a little bit. She's stretching the tendons that are connecting those muscles to those bones. When we stretch like that, it's just like stretching a rubber band. We're going to stretch it out, and we're going to store some elastic energy inside the muscle and inside the tendon. So then when she starts to jump upwards, she gets force from her muscles actually contracting, and she also then receives some additional force from the release of that elastic energy from the connective tissue inside of her muscles and from the tendon. Okay, so by doing, that's called a stretch and then a shorten, it's called a stretch shortening cycle. So by doing all of that, you're able to generate more force and jump a little bit higher. Or if you were going to do any kind of an activity, if you're going to throw a baseball, you're going to go back first. We're stretching here, and then I shorten when I come forward. So it's a stretch and then a shorten. We're storing extra energy. The same thing happens in your heart, okay, when we begin to exercise. And what happens is you get an increase in something called, okay, Nate said he didn't have pants on. That's I can appreciate that, Nate. That's fine. You get an increase in preload. Preload is a measure of how much blood gets pushed back into the left ventricle right before the heart beats, right before it contracts, okay? As we begin to exercise, several things are going to occur that are going to drive more blood back into the heart. We're not going to get into what those things are. Dr. Mike will cover all of them in exercise physiology, okay? But the end of all of that is that your left ventricle is not a plastic bottle. Your left ventricle is like it's like a bottle that's made out of rubber, okay? So that you can fill it up, but it has a normal volume, but it can stretch out a little bit and increase the inside volume. And as that stretches out, it's storing elastic energy inside the cardiac muscle. And so then when the heart contracts, then it has the force from the contraction from the cardiac muscle plus the force stored from the elastic energy. So that increases stroke volume. You guys may have learned about this in physiology class. When this happens in the heart, it's called the Frank-Starling law or the Frank-Starling mechanism of the heart, okay? But it's a way to increase the strength of cardiac contractions. One of the things that happens with people that are very sedentary and people that have high blood pressure is they're going to lose some of the elasticity in their cardiac muscle. And so their stroke volume can't go up as much. It will not stretch as much, and that can become bad and dangerous. The other way that we increase stroke volume, by increasing how forcefully the heart contracts, is through input from epinephrine and norepinephrine from the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, it tells the muscle to contract more forcefully. Okay. Additionally, we're going to get, you have something that's called decreased afterload, but stroke volume goes up because as arterioles going to skeletal muscle dilate, the pressure in the tissue where we want the blood to go is going to fall, and that makes it easier for blood to leave the heart. There's less resistance in our overall system, which again, we probably need to do an hour of the physics of the movement of fluid through tubes to really understand all of that. But the take home is that as we begin to exercise early on, stroke volume is going to go up, okay? From an increase in preload and an increase in epinephrine and norepinephrine leading to the left ventricle contracting more forcefully. So it's going to stop going up though, because there's only so much muscle, there's only so much elasticity, and once we max those things out, it can't go up any further, okay? It can't go up any further. So the other part of this though is that while stroke volume is increasing, early on, heart rate is also going to increase. And then once stroke volume stops increasing, heart rate is going to continue to increase, okay? And the largest increase in cardiac output is going to come from the increase in heart rate, okay? It's going to come from the increase in heart rate. And so what happens is that while you guys are resting, while we're just kind of sitting around, we have almost no sympathetic nervous system input into the cardiovascular system unless you're really stressed, okay? What we tend to have at rest is parasympathetic input. We call that, it comes from the vagus nerve, and it's often referred to as vagal tone. And that just means how much acetylcholine is being released onto the SA node at rest. And so as you go from sitting to standing to walking, the first thing that happens to make heart rate go up is we just remove the sympathetic nervous system input. That goes away. The SA node loses the inhibitory effect of acetylcholine, so it's going to fire more often. As intensity goes up, you're going to begin to get epinephrine and norepinephrine from the sympathetic nervous system, and that's going to then begin to dominate and drive heart rate up higher and higher. Well, at some point, the SA node cannot fire any faster. You all have a maximal heart rate, okay? And typically, your maximal heart rate is going to be predominantly determined by your age, or it's at least predominantly related to your age. We can use an equation that is 220 minus your age, and that should give us what is called age-predicted max heart rate, okay? So most of you are somewhere around 20 years old, the vast majority of you, okay? Give or take a year or two. So you're going to have an age-predicted max heart rate that is pretty close to 200 beats per minute, okay? So one of the ways that we can know if you have reached an exercise intensity where you are truly maxing out your cardiac output is, have you reached or gotten very close to your age predicted max heart rate? Because we know that by the time you're at maybe, you guys are at maybe 120 or 130 beats per minute of heart rate, your stroke volume has plateaued. And then the only other way to increase cardiac output then is to increase heart rate. So once you get heart rate near its max, you've probably maxed out cardiac output. And that tells us that that exercise is very, very close to the highest intensity, the most amount of work that you can do under normal circumstances, okay? As you guys will see tomorrow, we can use heart rate during exercise and your age predicted max heart rate as a way to estimate how hard you're working and what you need, where you need to be when we prescribe aerobic exercise. That's why your Fitbit and the Apple Watches measure your heart rate, okay? It can give you an estimate of how hard you're working. So you can give somebody, hey, you're gonna go run today, we need you to be at 150 beats of heart rate per minute based upon your age and the intensity that we want you to work at. And so we'll talk about how we do all of that more so tomorrow, okay? Okay, so we talked about these things. We talked about why stroke volume is going to plateau for the most part. So here's just a graphical representation. In the one on the right, this shows stroke volume and its change across our treadmill speeds. Remember, we had the cardiac output one that was relatively linear. You guys will note that stroke volume goes up and then for the most part, it plateaus off. Whereas heart rate, and this is the really, really good and useful thing about heart rate, is that the increase in heart rate with the increase in exercise intensity and the increase in cardiac output is almost perfectly linear. And so what that means is that for any given increase in heart rate, there's going to be a corresponding, very predictable increase in cardiac output and a very predictable increase in energy use, which is why the cardiac output has to go up. It has to go up to supply energy, to supply oxygen, or remove CO2 from the energy being used in our muscles. Okay? And so that makes heart rate one of the best ways for us to predict and prescribe aerobic exercise. Okay? But we'll get into kind of how we do all of that tomorrow. Okay. Talked about those things. We talked about those things. I did mention that blood pressure goes up during exercise. That's really all that I want you to know. We've already talked about AVO2 difference a little bit. So I don't really want to, the purpose of this slide, and there may be something on the study guide about this. One of the things that happens, and I'm going to mention it, but we're not going to go any farther with it, is we can also use your breathing during a bout of exercise and changes in your breathing to predict how much lactate you're making without having to take a blood sample. So we can predict how much anaerobic metabolism you are or are not using. And that's kind of what this graph is trying to show, is there's this thing called the ventilatory breakpoint, where once you start making lactic acid, and you have extra hydrogen, that hydrogen is going to get buffered in the blood by those bicarbonate ions that we mentioned yesterday, and that's going to drive additional CO2 out of the blood into the lungs, and your breathing is going to increase sort of disproportionately to the amount of CO2 being made in your muscles. And so that's kind of a secondary thing. So that's the point of all of this, but I don't really want to talk about that. Okay. All right, so that's it for our slide today. So I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to